All right, let's talk about a mistake that you might be making with your press and you don't even know it. Or maybe you do know that you're making it, but you're having a tough time fixing this problem. Let me give you a little bit of a backstory here, all right? We've got our annual spring strength lifting challenge coming up. It's our annual spring strength lifting meet. We've got one in the fall as well. So strength lifting, squat, press, not the bench press, the press, and then the deadlift. And typically, now that's going to come up this upcoming Saturday. By the time this video comes out, it will already have happened. Typically what happens, once or twice, either in the fall or the spring, somebody locks out a press overhead and they get red lights and they're not exactly sure why. Not one of our lifters, because our lifters are coached on this, but it always happens once, twice a year, something like that. And what they're confused about is the fact that they got red lights for their knees, all right? Your knees need to stay straight when you are pressing. You go back, the press has been contested for much longer than the bench press. You go back in the Olympics, it used to be contested in the Olympics, you go back to the 40s, 50s, you usually saw some hip movement in the press. We like using the hips for a number of reasons. We're not gonna get into that here. And if you're doing what's often referred to as a strict press or a no hips press, or what we just like to call the weaker press, just kidding, but only slightly, you're probably not gonna have this problem with the knees, at least you shouldn't. But if you're using the hips, with great power comes great responsibility. You got to keep the knees straight. If your knees bend, it's no longer a press, it's a push press, all right? So as you reach forward with your hips, if your knees are unlocking, that's a problem you've got to solve. We're going to give you 5 cues, 5 ways to help solve this problem. Number 1, the simple approach. This is what we coach when we teach the movement the first time. Flex your quads. We very rarely cue muscle groups, but one of the times that we do cue muscle groups as opposed to movements is when we're trying to prevent movements. So contract your quads. Flex your quads tightly. They're responsible for straightening and keeping your knees straight. Flex your quads. Number 2, tight knees. This gets across the idea that your knees should remain tight, should remain rigid, should remain immovable during the movement. Number 3, lock your knees. Remind yourself to lock your knees before you start the hip movement, before you start the press, and keep them locked through the entire movement. Number 4, pull your kneecaps up. Go ahead, take a look down at your kneecaps. When you flex your quads, you'll notice that your kneecaps rise up slightly. It gives you a little bit of a visual picture of what you want to have happen before you start the movement, and then that position that you're going to keep throughout the movement. And number 5, this is one of my personal favorites, keep your knees back. In other words, as you move your hips forward, of course your knees actually do move forward as well because your knees are connected to your hips via your femurs, but your knees should never go as far forward as your hips do. The hips should be the furthest most part of your body during that movement, during that hip reaching process. So the idea of keeping your knees back can help you keep your knees straight throughout the process. Hope this helps you get stronger, live better, and make sure that your presses count.